Welcome to the Flight Club Podcast, a woman's guide to leaning out. We give you a behind-the-scenes look at business launch and growth through the stories of successful female entrepreneurs. Here's your host, Felina Hansen, founder and CEO of Hera Hub.
Hello and welcome. I am so looking forward to my conversation today with Sherman De Silva. She is the president and founder of a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to the conservation of Asian elephants and their habitats through science and education. The organization is called Trunks and Leaves. She is also a founder and trustee of the I might have to clarify this, but the acronym is EFECT in Sri Lanka. Her main passion is to find ways for people and wildlife to coexist by understanding and meeting the needs of both. She is a member of the Asian Elephant Specialist Group of the IUCN Species Survival Commission. And we're going to learn about her incredible background. She has an amazing story. I'm very excited to share it. Welcome to the show today, Sherman.
Thanks, Felina. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, take us back. You do have I'm looking at your profile here. You have such an amazing background. So start at the beginning. Take us back into how you became interested in this topic, where you went to school, and then let's wind along your career path.
So I am a product of the public education system in California. I grew up in Northern California, and I went to UC Berkeley because I was actually interested in paleontology all the whole time I was growing up as a kid. Actually grew up in Sri Lanka till the age of 9 or so, and then my family moved over because I wanted to go study dinosaurs ever since I was a kid.
How did that passion emerge?
Library books and TV documentaries. I always loved animals, but then, the prospect of these extinct animals that were no longer around just is, what kid doesn't love dinosaurs? And for me, it was just like out of this world. So unlike most kids, I held on to that until all the way through, when I was deciding where to go to school, I picked UC Berkeley because they had this phenomenal paleontology program. And I just fell in love with, seeing these dinosaurs in the atrium when you walk into the biology building. I thought that was the coolest thing on earth. And then, but when I started my my undergrad degree, I was just doing a biology degree, and I also was really interested in studying animal behavior, which is, all the documentaries again that I watched growing up as a kid. And at some point, I decided that I wanted to study living animals because there are all these conservation concerns for the species that are still around, and the dinosaurs sort of remind us what can happen, that species don't always stick around. So I shifted to something that I hope would have more practical relevance today with the species that are still living.
Amazing. And I also see that you studied a bit of philosophy at Berkeley. How did that come about?
Yeah, the beginning, I was much more academic in my interests. I was really interested in language and communication, specifically these branches of philosophy called philosophy of mind and philosophy of language. And they sort of merge with psychology and cognitive science and have to do with um, just how humans, acquired this ability and how we use this ability that is considered to be uniquely human, which is to actually have language, to be able to speak and communicate in this complex way that no other animal really seems to uh, be able to do, and this to the same degree. But I was also interested in how this relates to the rest of the animal kingdom, and that's actually what I was focused on in terms of animal behavior, and eventually what led me to elephants was the fact that elephants had this reputation for being really intelligent and socially
Mm.
complex animals that, if they're socially complex, then you expect them to communicate in complex ways.
Mhm.
And so that was one of the things that drew me to elephants, thinking that this is something that I could study, um, because we didn't really know a whole lot about the ways that elephants communicate.
So interesting. So you went on to get your PhD from there. Talk a little bit about the work you did at University of Pennsylvania.
So I decided to go to grad school, and I knew that I was going to study something to do with communication and language. And some of the papers that I had read, and some of I looked at a lot of different programs, and the researchers, so two of the researchers that really caught my attention were, they were primatologists actually, and they had been studying baboons and vervet monkeys, and they had been working for a very long time in Africa. And they were asking just the kinds of research questions that I was interested in. So their names were Robert Seifert and Dorothy Cheney. And when I approached them and they agreed to take me on as a student, I thought I would end up working on primates, but fortunately for me, they were happy to let me do whatever I wanted, more or
Hmm.
less, because they have very sort of hands-off style with their students, and so they just encouraged me to go and try out new things and go set up my own site, which is what I ended up doing in Sri Lanka, because as I mentioned, that's where I'm originally from, and
Hmm.
I was also looking for ways to kind of reconnect with Sri Lanka and go back.
Yeah.
More regularly because I had left, as a kid, and I had this kind of nostalgia about it. So we have a lot of elephants, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to study elephants, because I thought, it would be a good place to do that. So that's how I ended up starting my PhD work in elephants. I went back in 2004. That was the first time I started my graduate program, and then they encouraged me to go set up a field project, and I went in 2005 and kind of did the scoping. It was all very exciting, it was kind of adventure to go see what people are doing, and I looked at what other people were doing, and I thought I would just kind of start where other people had left off,
Mm.
at this other site that had been, like the Smithsonian had been in Sri Lanka since way back in the 1970s, and they'd done
Mm.
some pioneering work down in the south.
Mm.
Some of the earliest studies on Asian elephants. So there was that connection as well. So I thought, oh, this is perfect. I'll just go start and tack on my work to that. But it turned out that there was a lot missing in the years between.
Mm.
And the, so I had to start my own project for kind of basically from scratch. I had
Mm.
to set it up, and that's what I've been running pretty much ever since then. Since about 2005 when I did my pilot, and 2006 is when I started the work proper, and it's been going on ever since.
Now, Sherman, what was the status of the Asian elephant when you arrived, and what has changed over these years, if anything?
And so Asian elephants have been classified as endangered
Mm.
since the 1970s, pretty much since
Mm.
1975. And the the main um, decline of elephants, basically, what we're seeing is that it happened. It's been happening. It's been a relatively slow and gradual process that's been going on for really hundreds of years.
Mm.
And if you think about it, elephants, are big animals. They need a lot of space. And so the biggest concern for elephants has been that over time, our population, the human population, has
Mhm.
been growing. And, Asian elephants are found in Asia, which is the most populous continent, right? It has
Mhm.
India and China, which up until very recently, had been these huge growth centers.
Mhm.
And so they lost a lot of ground in those two countries.
Mhm.
And they're also found in other parts of Southeast Asia. Altogether today, they're in thirteen different countries. But a lot of the habitat that elephants have been in historically are now converted to other land uses, predominantly agriculture. So if you think of the big rice bowls of Thailand, for example, that was all elephant habitat once
Mm.
upon a time, and
Mm.
we go to the grocery store, we get our food from these far flung corners of the world, and all of that has an impact on the wildlife in those areas.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing today is really the consequence of a process that started a long time ago, and really ramped up during the colonial era.
Mm.
And
Okay.
so the status right now of elephants is still that they're endangered. It seems like in the more recent past few years, the populations have not they're more or less stable, so they're
Mm.
not doing great. They haven't improved or recovered. And in some parts of the Southeast Asia, they're actually critically endangered. So Sumatran elephants are critically endangered with just a few thousand animals. Bornean elephants are just a few hundred animals.
Mm.
Um, and in some parts of Asia, like in Vietnam, those populations are barely hanging on unless there's some dramatic action because they're in double digits right now.
Jeez.
So and you don't really hear about this because
Mm-mm.
you don't hear about we see Asian elephants in zoos or in captive situations, or people go to Thailand and they see a lot of captive elephants, and so they kind of take elephants for granted. They sort of don't realize that they're incredibly rare.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'm going to ask a couple questions here, Sherman. Number one, I want to get into, of course, I mean, you've been doing this work all your life. You've had several fellowships, one with the Smithsonian, among many others. Um, I mean, you have dedicated your life to this. I want to get to the nonprofit that you founded, Trunks and Leaves, and talk about that specifically because you've been running that organization now for about 8 years. But before we do that, I want to ask a very obvious, definitely dumb question, but I'm going to break it down, just to lay it out here. I mean, obviously, we know all species are important. They're part of our ecosystem. We, pull one species out of an ecosystem and it, affects the entire ecosystem, of course. And we've seen this many, many times.
Mhm.
But specifically with Asian elephants, just the most basics, why is this so important? And I know this is a dumb question because I know it's
There's
extremely
no such
important,
thing. It's okay.
but I just want, give us like the basics of why this is so important.
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's not a dumb question at all. And in fact, a few years ago, we made a little animation talking about why elephants are important for their ecosystems.
Yeah.
Um, and so, it boils down to this. Every species has a role that it plays. But when you have large animals like elephants, there are what's called, ecosystem engineers or keystone species. And
Mm,
that's the idea that they have a lot of interactions with other species. So
mm,
they interact with other, with obviously with the plants and things that they eat, but also other, animals that live in the little microhabitats that they create, even something like elephant dung. There
mhm,
are animals that feed off of that and live in that. And then, of
yeah.
course, there are tree species and plant species that elephants are the dispersers of their
Mm,
seeds. And so elephants are just involved in a whole lot of interactions in their ecosystems. And if you take out an animal like that, it's going to have lots of effects on those ecosystems, some of which, we might be able to anticipate, but some of which we might not. And it doesn't mean that, those ecosystems are going to collapse, entirely or anything like that. But it does mean that those systems are going to be changed. And there are examples. For example, in South America, there used to be relatives of elephants. You
mm,
might not know this,
mm,
but elephants were once upon a time they were found throughout all the different continents. Elephants are things that resembled elephants,
mhm,
and so when, for example, the best known extinctions that are, the mammoths, the woolly mammoths and
mhm,
mastodons and things in North America, Siberia, they were living on these grassy steppes. And not only did these animals, you know, eat the grass, but they were probably also maintaining that type of open grassy ecosystem by doing that. And so without the elephants there, then you have more forests, more, so different kind of ecosystem that takes over. So that's the role that elephants play. And in general, like for any species, it's not that losing a particular species is going to be catastrophic for us. It's just that we humans are having such a big impact on all these different species, and elephants are just sort of a major representative of that. More close to home, that one of the challenges that elephants bring up is they represent habitats, they represent ecosystems, and a whole lot of other species that we don't really see, little
Mm.
critters, snakes and
Mhm.
birds, and lots of other species that live in those same habitats. And so when those habitats disappear, we don't really notice them necessarily. We don't notice those other species, but we do notice elephants.
Yeah.
And so they're sort of like a red flag because they
Mm.
point to problems. And in particular, when habitats disappear, elephants live a really long time, so they can still be around. You'll
Mm.
still see them, and that can create conflicts with people. And one of the biggest challenges right now is what we call human elephant conflict, what some
Mm.
people call human elephant conflict, which is that elephants and farmers have a lot of conflict because some elephants will feed on agricultural crops, because you
Mm.
remember agricultural crops are what replaces elephant habitat a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And there's also large scale infrastructure development and all kinds of things that we in the modern era are altering the landscape with. And so while other wildlife will just kind of quietly disappear, elephants highlight the problem. And
Mm.
that's another reason why they're sort of this important species for us to put a focus on.
Hmm. So interesting. Thank you for explaining that in the simplest terms, because I think it's helpful for us that don't know a lot about this to really, visualize that,
Mhm.
as you gave us a demonstration there. Sherman, I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about your nonprofit here.
Mhm.
So let's go ahead and dive into that.
Mhm.
And you're doing, all kinds of work, at the same, you've got many projects going, but all related to conservation of the Asian elephant. But specifically your nonprofit, how did that come about that you decided, you know what, I'm going to do this, I'm going to form this nonprofit, and talk about some of the work that you've been doing over the last 8 years?
Yeah. So when I finished my PhD, I knew that, as the academic sort of trajectory typically goes, you do one or more postdocs after you finish your PhD. And I knew that I wanted to continue doing the work that I was doing. I had this field site that I intended to maintain long term, but at the same time, I knew that I might be hopping from institution to institution, from like university to university in these different positions, and I wanted to have some sort of continuity,
Mhm.
um, it's a sort of home for what I was doing. And so I looked around, and initially I was looking for, another nonprofit that might, or some other organization that might sponsor or serve as a sort of home base for the work that I was doing. I founded a trust in Sri Lanka, which I also use for, grants and fundraising and things like that. So I had that established already. And then, but I was looking around, and unfortunately, there didn't seem to be a whole lot of interest in, um, I don't know, the system or the species, Asian elephants in particular, or where I was working specifically. Just because, like as I said, there isn't hasn't been as much recognition of the threats to these environments and ecosystems and
Mm.
Asian elephants specifically. There were a lot of um, efforts focused on African elephants, and you hear certainly a lot more about African elephants. But also, I think just Asian wildlife in general, you don't see them. Wildlife in forested environments, you don't see them. You hear about rainforests a whole lot. A lot of the Asian elephant habitat is in rainforest, but a lot of it
Mm.
is also not in rainforest. So there are certain causes and certain types of things that get a lot more attention than others. And so I just decided that, well, there didn't seem to be a good fit for the kinds of things that I wanted to do, so I just went ahead and started the nonprofit myself, with help from resources at the time when I was in Massachusetts. I worked with the law clinic there at Harvard to help
Mm.
get it registered, And ever since then, I've pretty much been trying to raise awareness about the conservation needs and threats in this part of the world for this species.
Absolutely. So, talk a little bit about what that work has looked like. I mean, raising awareness, of course. I mean, is that the primary focus? Are you on the ground there on a regular basis? Just talk a little bit more about that work.
Yes, my research has been focused primarily in Sri Lanka with the project that I started back in graduate school. And so I've maintained this research site in southern Sri Lanka, where we study one population of elephants that we know really well, and um, and I've had various research projects over the years and PhD students and different researchers coming through studying elephant behavior and now and more recently we've started studying the communities of people that live outside of the protected areas that are trying to make a living alongside elephants,
Hmm.
and our work is focusing more in that direction now.
Hmm.
um, and at the same time, so that's I have collaborations with other researchers working in other parts of the world and other populations, um, relating how how Asian elephants behave and the way that Asian elephants environments are, comparing that to how other elephant populations behave in Asia or Africa. And but outside of Sri Lanka, my aim with the organization is to be more broad, to be more internationally focused. So we've had a few things in that direction, more to do with education. So I mentioned an animation that we created some
Mhm.
years ago about the importance of elephants in their ecosystems, and this we made available for people to download and translate into whatever language they
Mm,
wanted. So that's been
mm,
done a few times in a few different countries. Um, and we've participated in a documentary film
mm,
that was made several years ago and aired on BBC. And I give a lot of public talks and lectures and things. That's my main way of really getting the
mm,
word out.
mhm,
Giving sort of presentations and lectures and talks and things like that. So I do a lot of outreach, whatever way I can, besides doing the research itself. And of course, we also maintain our online sort of presence
mhm.
in broadcasting our work and our findings on our blogs and social media and things like that. So whatever way I can. And then you mentioned that my involvement with the Asian Elephant Specialist Group. That's as of relatively
Mhm.
recently. The IUCN has different specialist groups, and this is just one of them, focused on elephants. And so through that and other kinds of professional, more professional research oriented groups, we try to be involved in uh, not only just research but also shaping policy and
Mhm.
sort of general assessments of the status of elephants and things like that.
Yeah, amazing. And I
Mhm,
mentioned this in your intro, and you talked about it a few minutes ago.
mhm.
You're the founder and trustee of, and I said, I'm assuming it's an acronym
Effect.
for something,
Yes.
EFECT. I almost said effect, but that's
Yeah,
not
you
quite
can say
right.
effect.
So,
That's
can you
why
tell
we
us
picked
what that
that
means?
acronym.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of I liked the acronym better than the whole name is a mouthful. It's the Elephant
Okay.
Forest and Environment Conservation Trust, but really the effect is fine.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah,
I
so
didn't
that's
want to
it's a
butcher it.
yeah, that's the trust that I mentioned that's based
Okay.
in Sri Lanka, through which I primarily, that I raise grant funding and things like that for the research that we do in Sri Lanka.
That's great. Awesome. I wanna kind of round out our conversation here with talking about these amazing animals. We hear bits about, stories of somebody who knew an elephant, a human being, and then they left for 20 years and they came back and the elephant remembered them. I mean, it's just talk a little bit about how amazing these animals are.
Yeah, elephants are. I think there's a kind of thing among elephant people that once you're an elephant person, you can never go back. Like you once an elephant person, always an elephant person. You can never study anything else. It's it's kind of true. They sort of spoil you for other things. I look at, monkeys and I think, gosh, they're so small. How does anyone study that? 'Cause I'm just used to seeing these big things on the landscape. Um, and and I don't know, I can't speak to that so much for the wild elephants. I think stories like
Sure.
that are a lot from people who've worked up close with elephants,
Hmm.
up in much more personal ways than
Sure.
we get to when we're studying wild elephants. But it wouldn't surprise me because elephants do have the among the biggest brains of animals in the animal kingdom, and they have a very long time that they use to develop these big brains. They have a 20-month long gestation period
Mm.
compared to our 9 months, which
Yeah.
is among the longest in the animal kingdom. So a baby elephant is born um, bigger and heavier and prone to getting into a lot of trouble because of these big brains. Because they're just like little children. They explore and they're inquisitive and they get into lots of trouble, and they live in these societies where they know and recognize lots of other individuals. So
Mm.
that requires quite some memory. um, and they have a very different way of being in the world than we do. So we're very visual animals, but elephants rely primarily on their sense of smell and their hearing,
Mm.
and they can differentiate probably lots of other individuals based on how they sound, probably also based on how they smell, although that hasn't really been tested yet.
Mm.
And there's a whole invisible world similar to how you imagine dogs must perceive their world, right? So
Yeah.
anyone who has a dog as a pet knows that they're all about smell.
Hmm.
Right, and elephants, they have this huge long nose, and they probably not just smell, where things are right now, but where things were, where people were, where elephants were, where other animals were, and there's a whole invisible world that's open to elephants that we can't really perceive. And not only that, but they probably smell things that are really subtle, like emotions. When something,
Mm.
when another animal is distressed, when one of their other companions is upset, that you see them sniffing. And it's just not a
Yeah.
reaction that we would have, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, with these species that are so different from us, we have to imagine that their worlds have so many layers that we don't even perceive or comprehend because we just can't, we don't have the same kind of senses they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. It has definitely spurred me to go learn more about the Asian elephant, and I want to thank you for the work you're doing, Sherman. I mean, you have dedicated your life to this, and I have no doubt you have made a huge impact on the research and obviously the hope that we continue to have these amazing animals around for a very, very long time. So, with that, if our listeners want to learn more about you, the organization, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way is to visit our website, which is trunksandleaves.org. That's spelled trunks, TRUNK, the letter N, and leaves, LEAVES.org. And you can ways that you can learn and follow about our work, as well as a contact form. And as I mentioned, we have our work right now is looking more towards how people and elephants can share the landscape, which is the most important question going forward.
Yeah.
So there's information there about what we're doing to help the communities that are living next to elephants in these outside of protected areas, and we have some exciting initiatives that we're hoping to unfold in the next couple of years. With new methods to help people make a livelihood, more sustainable livelihood while living next to elephants.
Amazing. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Sherman. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Felina, for having me.
Thank you for joining this week's episode of Flight Club, sponsored by Hera Hub. We look forward to sharing more success stories with you soon.